What could have happened if President Harry Truman had not dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the invasion of Japan had actually occurred has been the subject of considerable conjecture in the more than 50 years since the end of World War II. One document which explains what was done, what was available to defend against the Kyushu campaign, an Allied invasion of the home island of Kyushu, and what the actual defenses were, was unavailable to researchers until recently. It does not explain what the Japanese military leaders intended to do. U.S. intelligence personnel started questioning Japanese officials as soon as American forces invaded Japan. The officers of the Japanese Second General Army, which was in charge of defending Kyushu, and its subordinate units, which Sixth Army forces would have engaged in combat with had the invasion occurred, were questioned by the U.S. Sixth Army G2 section, which included the Marine V Amphibious Force. On December 31, 1945, the report of the interrogations was released. However, it was immediately designated top secret and kept out of the public eye. For over 50 years, it stayed that way. The material has been accessible to the public via the U.S. government since 2006. Research Library for Army Combined Arms at Kansas's Leavenworth. The data in that publication provide a far more realistic evaluation of what the U.S. would have encountered if the Sixth Army had launched its planned invasion of southern Kyushu. The Plan of Ketsu-Go. The Japanese Imperial High Command discussed the next course of action for the Allies following the invasion of the Philippines by American forces. Landings on the Chinese coast, invasions of Formosa, landings in Korea, and landings on one of the Japanese home islands were among the options that were contemplated. When U.S. troops invaded the Ryukyu Islands in April 1945, some Japanese officers correctly concluded that the first landings would probably take place on the southern part of the island of Kyushu to set up air bases in preparation for a larger movement against Tokyo itself through the Kanto Plain. The Ketsu-Go strategy was created to account for that possibility. Early in 1945, the plan for defending the nation from invasion was formulated, and in March, the Imperial High Command gave its approval. The goal was to destroy an Allied invasion fleet as far away from Japan as possible. If any troops did manage to make it to the Japanese coast, they were to be destroyed on the beaches. Ketsu-Go ordered the conversion of the country's surviving aircraft for crash landing operations and ordered hundreds of special attack aircraft, Kamikaze, to be launched at an invading fleet while it was still at sea. At sea, the Imperial Navy would launch sorties to confront the opposing fleet. If the enemy continued to approach, it would be assaulted by small boats loaded with explosives when it anchored offshore, and by thousands of smaller submarines and suicide ships as it approached Kyushu. It was anticipated that the combination of the naval battle and the suicidal airstrike would target the troop carriers, extract a terrible toll before the invading soldiers ever reached shore, and, if all went according to plan, force the enemy fleet to retreat. The Imperial High Command anticipated that by defeating an invading fleet, Japan would be able to negotiate a peace that would avoid the unconditional surrender conditions made by the United States, even though it knew that Japan could not win the war. After the Casablanca Conference, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. However, after the plan was drafted, Japan's military circumstances significantly changed, and by the time the nation surrendered before the first American soldier ever set foot on the home islands, the plan's objectives had grown quite ambitious, as the Second General Army interrogations would demonstrate. Japan didn't retain their top soldiers at home. It was widely held that Japan kept its best soldiers at home to protect the country, but this view contradicts the mindset of the militarists who led the nation to war. Japan's military chiefs and the soldiers they commanded believed they were unbeatable and that their forces would vanquish Japan's foes thousands of miles from home until American forces took Saipan in the middle of 1944. As a result, when Japan began its invasion into Southeast Asia in December 1941, only 4 divisions of the Imperial Japanese Army, or about 70,000 soldiers, were still in the home islands. By the middle of 1944, that figure had dropped to just 11 divisions, or about 5,000 troops. Even though the Japanese were considering an invasion of the home islands after U.S. soldiers landed on Saipan in June 1944, Actual home defense preparations did not start until early 1945, when it became clear that the home islands were in danger. An estimated 1.5 to 1.9 million men made up the Imperial Japanese Army's homeland military force by the middle of 1945, divided into 53 divisions and support units. However, almost all of those divisions had only been formed within the previous 6 months and were composed of recent recruits and reservists, many of whom were as young as 16 or as old as 60. The home islands are home to less than half of Japan's military. China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia still house the majority of the Imperial Japanese Army. They had been cut off from reinforcement, supplies, and evacuation to their country, and hundreds of thousands of them were in the Philippines, New Guinea, and on Pacific Islands. By the end of the war, 7 of the 14 divisions on Kyushu had been formed since May, and their soldiers lacked much military experience. In addition to their poor training, Japan's arsenals were devoid of the weapons needed to outfit new battalions. Only half of the required firearms and less than a quarter of the required light machine guns were available. Because bayonets were scarce, artillery was replaced by mortars. There was little chance that an adequate supply would ever be generated, as the nation's factories were constantly being bombed into rubble and its towns reduced to flames by Boeing B-29 Superfortress firebombing missions. In order to protect against invasion, it was also thought that Japan's finest soldiers were sent home. Japan's deployed military troops stayed abroad during the war, with the exception of a few divisions that moved from Formosa and Manchuria. 2 former Manchurian divisions were on Kyushu. Less than half of the Japanese military's projected 5 million troops were stationed in the home islands toward the end of the war, and the only foreign units that maintained contact with their home country were those in China, Manchuria, Indochina, and Korea. The air and sea power of the Allies endangered even those lines. 14 Kyushu divisions. The only armed force in Japan to survive was the Japanese Army, but by the middle of 1945, it was scarcely an elite force with a lot of combat experience. Since Japan was never invaded, very few of its soldiers had ever seen combat and never would. Not even the soldiers returning from Manchuria and Formosa had any combat experience. The only fighting in Manchuria since the 1930s had been against communist partisans, who were more concerned with revolution than with overthrowing Japan, and Formosa was a Japanese territory. 3 Japanese divisions and 1 independent brigade, totaling around 62,000 soldiers, were in Kyushu in the spring of 1945 when General Douglas MacArthur's staff started organizing Operation Downfall, a 2-pronged invasion of Japan. Following the Battle of Okinawa and Germany's surrender in May, the Japanese High Command started fortifying the sizable island in preparation for an invasion. The 40th Army Headquarters moved up from Formosa to assume command of the defense of the western sector of southern Kyushu, while 2 divisions were brought out of Manchuria and another from Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan. Establishing and activating new units with troops already on the island in other roles, augmented by new recruits and recalled reservists, made up the majority of the reinforcement. Japanese forces in and around Kyushu grew to 14 divisions by the end of the war, including 4 in northern Kyushu, along with 3 tank brigades and 7 infantry divisions. The forces on Kyushu and neighboring islands were completed by a communications brigade, 2 fortification units, an anti-aircraft division, and several headquarters. After May 1945, the majority of these units were activated. There were a total of 3,833 soldiers at the time of the surrender, 78283 men in northern Kyushu who were to be held in reserve, and 276550 troops in southern Kyushu who were to meet the invading forces. Before the assault, no additional reinforcement was anticipated. Operation Destruction. Kyushu is a big island with predominantly mountainous topography that is almost 200 miles long and 820 miles wide. Only a 3,000 square mile portion of the southern end of the island, which is primarily rural and divided from the rest by a mountain range that runs the length of it, was to be occupied and secured by American forces as part of Operation Downfall. According to 6th Army intelligence, There were 73,000 Japanese soldiers from all branches of the military on Kyushu and the neighboring islands, 25,000 at the time of the surrender. Some of them were from units traveling via Kyushu ports on their way to other locations. The remainder consisted of newly mobilized civilian volunteer battalions, naval and air force personnel, and army base and support forces. Sasebo was home to Japan's third-largest naval base, but due to severe losses and a shortage of fuel, the Japanese Navy had all but vanished, leaving thousands of shipless sailors to perform a variety of tasks on the island, such as operating guns that had been taken from battleships and used as coastal artillery. The presence of many recent naval recruits also increased the overall number of military troops. Although the naval personnel may have been utilized to supplement combat groups, they would have been a temporary solution rather than a potent fighting force because the majority had not been trained for ground combat. By the time of the surrender, plans had not yet been put into action for naval forces to replace Army personnel in tasks like coast monitoring and fortified position manning to safeguard Kyushu's harbors. There were about 800 aircraft on the island, and the Air Force personnel included pilots as well as maintenance and support staff. A vast number of civilian volunteers, base and support troops made up a sizable portion of the total, as did members of the newly formed People's Volunteer Fighting Corps, who were employed in support capacities overseeing communications, transportation, supply, and traffic, but would have been grouped into combat units as the threat of invasion grew closer. According to pre-surrender intelligence, there were approximately 14,000 civilian volunteers in southern Kyushu and over 4,000 in the north, while the 6th Army report does not provide an exact number. Since the Japanese were relying on porters and pack animals as their main mode of transportation, after the Allied air bombardment had left motorized transit on the island worthless, their most significant function was that of human pack mules, transporting supplies to battle units. Supplies were delivered to the field by human porters after being transported by animals to distribution sites. According to Japanese officers, Kyushu did not have the much-discussed home defense forces that were meant to meet the invaders with wooden pikes, pitchforks, and awls. Similar to the Army, Japan's aviation forces, both naval and Army, were sent abroad at the start of the conflict. As the war dragged on, Japan's air forces were drastically reduced, in contrast to the Army, which was bolstered domestically with fresh recruits. Despite their early war image of invincibility, they lost dominance of the skies by the end of 1942 and declined so much over the next 2 years that when the U.S., in November 1944, B-29s began flying over Japan from the Marianas, only 375 Japanese fighters were in opposition to the American pilots. Japan didn't start bolstering its home fighter defenses until the start of the firebombing assaults the following spring, and even then, the increase was only slight. Surprisingly, Japanese manufacturers manufactured more than 28,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, but very few of them stayed in Japan, which was largely out of range of Allied bombers until November. Before they ever reached the battle zones, many were lost in training and ferrying mishaps, and many were grounded due to a shortage of parts and fuel. Bombs guided by humans and missiles powered by jets. The Imperial High Command believed that the enemy would soon be landing in the home islands after Okinawa fell into Allied hands. They planned to defeat the invading fleet while it was still at sea in order to counter the threat. It was anticipated that dozens of troop carriers would be destroyed by massive employment of special attack aviation units before they ever got close to the landing beaches. The goal was to adapt as many aircraft as possible for use in crash landing or special attack, which mostly involved installing a bomb. The Army and Navy relied on the trainers, transporters, and other support aircraft that were still in stock to boost numbers and ensure success due to the shortage of combat planes. Although they were not manufactured in significant quantities, new weapons for special attack use, such as human-guided bombs and flying bombs powered by rockets and jets, were developed. It was widely assumed that Japan possessed thousands, possibly even 1,000, of special attack aircraft that might be used against a fleet of Allied invaders. Some Japanese interviewed after the war proposed this figure, which was included in monographs released in 1946. Kamikaze assaults were thought to have begun when the invasion fleet was halfway between Okinawa and Kyushu, and they would have persisted throughout the landings and against the troops once they were on land. The officers of the Second General Army had a different account. No intentions to employ kamikazes. They responded that they had 800 bombers and that the majority of them would be deployed in the special attack or crash landing role against the transports, while the invading force was still at sea when asked how many combat-type aircraft they anticipated having available and how they were to be used. Additionally, they said that 560 aircraft, or around 70% of the total, would be kept in reserve on Kanto and in Korea in case of future landings. To put it briefly, the Japanese officers disclosed that, rather than 1,000 aircraft, there were less than 1,400 planes ready to defend against an invasion of the home islands. According to the Japanese, some aircraft would be deployed as conventional bombers at first, but as the strikes went on, they would also be ordered to do crash landings. They claimed that no air support was planned for the ground troops because attacks on the fleet would deplete the supply of aircraft, and that there were no preparations to employ kamikazes against troops during or after the landings. The officials added that, at the time of the surrender, Kyushu had no locations for the launch of jet-powered missiles. Although 10 potential launch locations in northern Kyushu had been identified, no work ever started. They also disclosed that rocket-powered aerial bombs were not yet included in the inventory and were still in the experimental stage. The Second General Army Interrogations Report refutes the frequently made claims that the Japanese had concealed thousands of aircraft in caves and subterranean facilities on Kyushu. Officials from the Second General Army disclosed that the Special Assault and Conventional Air Units were to use 20 airfields on Kyushu. U.S. airstrikes had not significantly reduced the effectiveness of the planes, which had been scattered away from the airfields by the time hostilities ended on August 17th. The aircraft would be moved from their hiding spots to the airfields and launched in a mass attack upon detection of an invading fleet. These assaults would go on until the aircraft force was depleted. According to reports, several aircraft were scattered up to 5 miles away from the airports where they were to be taken off. The Japanese responded 10% when asked how much damage they expected the air units to cause to the invading force. They anticipated that over 1/3 of the aircraft would be intercepted and destroyed before they reached the Allied fleet, but that the remaining aircraft would be able to damage troop transports enough to interfere with the landings. That was an overly optimistic anticipation. During the Battle of Okinawa, just 1 out of 9 special attack aircraft made it to the point where they could actually attack a target, and a comparatively small percentage of those aircraft managed to sink a ship. Kamikaze attacks off Okinawa resulted in the sinking of 36 destroyers and small ships, and 164 ships suffered various degrees of damage. It seems unlikely that even 1 out of 10 aircraft on the island would have reached the transports, much less launched a successful attack, given the anticipated large-scale deployment of Allied aircraft over Kyushu and the invading fleet at the time of the invasion. Few Japanese pilots in 1945 possessed the experience necessary for night operations, despite the military circumstances at the time of the invasion requiring Japanese air attacks to be conducted at night in order to be successful. At best, those rated for night operations had only a passing qualification. In 1945, the average Japanese pilot had only flown for 100 hours. Special attack unit pilots had even fewer hours. Aircraft were free to take off and assemble during the battle for Okinawa because Kyushu was not under the cover of Allied fighters. By the end of the war, everything had altered. The United States would have been in charge of Kyushu, which was constantly being attacked by aircraft. Navy carrier aircraft would have provided coverage for the fleet, while Army and Marine fighters flew from airfields in the Ryukyus before and during the invasion. Any aircraft that would have taken off during the day would probably have been detected and destroyed in a matter of minutes. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighters, which patrolled the skies around the island at night, would have been able to detect even night takeoffs. The effectiveness of the shipboard guns was significantly enhanced by the employment of radar and proximity fuses by naval anti-aircraft, while the Allies had acquired efficient night fighter capabilities by 1945. Before they hit a target, any aircraft that made it to the fleet would have been shot down. The only time any Japanese pilots could have seen ships on the surface without their own radar would have been in the moonlight, and even then, they would have had trouble telling the difference between an escorting and a cargo ship. It would have been hard for the Japanese to tell if an incoming fleet was the invasion force or just another Pacific Fleet combat sortie into their waters. Finding out if there were transports engaged was the only way to identify an invasion fleet. By the time of the Japanese surrender, surface ships regularly approached near enough to land to shell shore installations, and Allied carrier planes were attacking targets in Japan virtually every day. On July 14th, the first surface assault occurred when the U.S. numerous attacks had been carried out after the Third Fleet shelled a foundry at Kamikaze. The Imperial Navy was supposed to launch a forceful sortie and intercept the invaders as part of the Ketsu-Go plans, but by August 1945, the Navy had been shut down. The remaining Japanese fleet was struck by American and British carrier planes at Kure, and by the end of July, it was totally rendered inoperable. The fleet's death was marked by a strike by 7th Air Force B-24 Liberator bombers. Only 12 ships and 40 submarines were anticipated to be available to defend against invasion, according to the officers of the 2nd General Army. The submarines were to monitor the waters south and east of Kyushu, while the destroyers were to discharge 50 human torpedoes against the Allied transports as they stood offshore. Additionally, 100 small submarines were to operate out of the Bungo Straits near northern Kyushu, and 30 midget submarines were to be utilized against the transports. The submarines and destroyers would need to break through a barrier of U.S. The transports would have been vulnerable to air attacks at their shore installations and at sea, and Navy destroyers and cruisers would have been able to approach them closely enough to cause any harm. The Army planned to use 1,000 small boats, each loaded with 550 pounds of explosives, to smash into the sides of the transports in addition to the remnants of the Japanese Navy. By the conclusion of the war, the commander of the 40th Army disclosed that the boats assigned to his region were still not in southern Kyushu. They would have most likely been deployed at night, he added, but no clear tactics had been prepared for their employment. Although he did not specify if his boats had been delivered by the conclusion of the war, his counterpart with the 57th Army said that the boats in his sector would have been sent out at night in groups of about 30. The Japanese aimed to sink 60 transports using a variety of surface suicide weapons and submarines, in addition to the 10 peak they anticipated destroying via airstrike. To protect against submarine attacks, a number of minefields had been set up near Kyushu, although the largest concentrations were off Nagasaki and other port cities. Plans to build large minefields off the beaches had not been completed by the end of the war, and about 200 mines had been planted off each of the anticipated landing places in Kyushu. There had been no preparations to obstruct the landings using submerged impediments. Due in part to unfavorable international perception and their awareness that they could not match Allied efforts, the Japanese had no intentions to employ chemical warfare of any kind. With one exception, they also didn't anticipate that U.S. soldiers would utilize it. If the Allies were successful in driving the invaders back, they were ready for the deployment of poison gas on their soldiers as a last resort. For that possibility, at least a few of their soldiers had been outfitted with protective gear and gas masks. The civilian population had not been protected from such weapons by any preparations. A B-29 attack had destroyed all the components of Japan's nuclear development program. The 2nd General Army did not question Japan about its nuclear testing. The defenders were aware that thousands of U.S. forces would arrive on shore, but the primary objective of the Ketsu-Go strategy was to defeat the invaders while they were still at sea. In the past, Japanese leaders had permitted Allied forces to land on Pacific Islands virtually unopposed, then attacked them with ferocity once they were on the ground. Their men were scattered with the intention of defeating the invaders at the water's edge at Kyushu. They had positioned defenses in the general area where they anticipated the landing of U.S. soldiers. However, they were unable to pinpoint the precise landing sites, thus their fortifications were spread out over a large area. In southern Kyushu, between 1/5 and 1/3 of the Japanese forces were stationed directly on the beaches to confront the Americans as they disembarked from their landing boats. The largest concentrations of Japanese troops were found in places with minimal natural cover, Prior to the invasion, senior Japanese commanders were aware that Allied air attacks would drastically reduce their forces on the beaches, but they still believed that enough men would survive to successfully repel the landings. 1,000 rifles, 2 70mm guns, 12 heavy machine guns, 31 light machine guns, 2 75mm guns, 4 37mm anti-tank guns, and an equal number of mortars were the weapons of an infantry battalion. Each battalion was supposed to fight till death, and no plans were prepared for resupply. Troops were given enough small arms ammunition for one battle, while artillery battalions were allocated 500 rounds per gun. On the beaches itself, a thin line of machine gun positions and foxholes at the edge of the dunes would serve as the initial line of defense. In order to launch counterattacks against American troops who made it to the beaches, they would be supported by fortified positions on higher land behind them, with the strongest fortifications at the back. However, the Japanese had not prepared for them, and there were no in-depth fortifications. Their sole tactic was to cause significant losses and prevent the enemy forces from forming a beachhead. Due to the region's predominance of lava and limestone, camps were mostly set up in natural caves or underground bunkers. By the conclusion of the war, defensive preparations were between 60 and 90% complete, with plans for tunnels to offer interconnected positions and enable undetected troop movements. The high ground behind the beaches was used for reinforced positions, and the fortifications made use of man-built bunkers in addition to natural caves and rock shelters. Although the Japanese defense plans relied heavily on artillery, interrogators from the Sixth Army discovered that senior officials recognized that their current arsenal was insufficient to achieve their goal of destroying the invaders on the beaches. With no centralized way to focus on a particular region, artillery was distributed among the many divisions. Apparently to conserve ammo, artillery was not to be employed against the amphibious forces until after they were landed. In addition to having few firearms, the Japanese had no preparations for what to do with the ones they did have. There was no centralized fire control system, and there was hardly any contact between units for coordinated fire. Their primary goal was to cover areas with sparse troop concentrations by using artillery as flanking fire on the beaches. Kyushu's anti-aircraft defenses were limited to 410 guns of various types, most of which were placed around key airfields and installations. Although anti-aircraft units were supposed to defend themselves if U.S. ground forces neared their positions, no plans had been established to utilize them in the land fight due to their weak numbers. As coastal defense weaponry, several high-angle naval anti-aircraft guns had been taken from ships. Including self-propelled guns, the total number of tanks in southern Kyushu was 275. However, all of them were medium to light, and it was thought that there were no heavy tanks on the island. The American Shermans would be too strong for them. Tanks would mostly be used alongside infantry on the beaches of Miyazaki and around Ariake Bay. To protect against airborne operations, the 1st Special Tank Unit, consisting of 27 light tanks, was stationed close to Miyakanajo. For the anti-tank mission, around 100 tanks were to be stationed in dugouts around Lake Ikeda. Infantry weapons, which are small explosives mounted on long poles, would be the main defense against tanks. Tank traps and anti-tank artillery were regarded as supplementary defenses because bazooka-type anti-tank weaponry were in scarce supply. By the end of the war, no mines had been planted, and none seemed to be forthcoming, despite the ground commander's desire to employ them. Senior commanders came to the conclusion that most minefields would be destroyed by naval and aircraft bombardment, and that the explosives employed for them would be better utilized as blasting powder. One might speculate as to how successful the Japanese defenses would have been. At Kyushu, the primary focus was on the beaches themselves, as opposed to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where stronger defenses were erected off the beaches. When forces pushed inland, reinforced positions fiercely resisted the initial strategy, which was based on concealment and shelter from airstrike and bombardment during the landings. By hiding underground, Japanese forces on both islands had survived long enough to cause significant deaths. This luxury would be rare for troops in Kyushu. The troops were placed at the water's edge, where they would be exposed to air and naval bombardment as part of the Japanese goal to completely destroy the landing forces before they could establish a beachhead. The conquest of Okinawa and Ishima in the Ryukyus satisfied the Allies' need to have powerful land-based aviation units within striking distance of the beaches in order for the invasion to occur. As soon as the airfields at Kadena and Naha were secured, Far East Air Forces, which included the 7th Air Force from Nimitz's forces and the 5th and 13th Air Forces that had been under MacArthur's command, started deploying fighter and bomber units onto Okinawa. As soon as the squadrons were brought up from the Philippines, 5th Air Force fighters and B-24s joined the 7th Air Force fighter bombers that had started attacking Kyushu in May. Compared to the single-engine carrier aircraft that had been the backbone of operations in the Central Pacific, the significantly East Air Forces provided a significantly more potent strike force. Its fighter groups were outfitted with North American P-51 Mustangs that served as fighter bombers and interceptors, Lockheed P-38 Lightnings with twin engines, and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts with a single engine. While the main medium bomber was the North American B-25 Mitchell, many of which had been modified as strafers. 2 B-25 models were fitted with 75mm cannons, while heavy bomber groups flew B-24s. Douglas A-20 Havocs, which also had gun systems in the nose, were flown by light bomber squadrons. The Douglas A-26 Invader, designed to replace the A-20 and B-25 strafers, was deployed in a number of squadrons by 1945. It was equipped with 14 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Marine squadrons flew B-25s, Grumman TBF Avengers, and Chance Vought F-4U Corsairs. Although their forces were not positioned precisely at the actual landing sites, in several cases they were miles away. The Japanese had inferred the most likely locations for the Allies to land. In reality, a large portion of the southern Kyushu army was stationed far to the north of the planned landing beaches. The southwestern part of the island was defended by the 40th Army, which had 3 divisions and a separate brigade. The 125th Independent Mixed Brigade, 7313 soldiers, was stationed on the southern end of the Satsuma Peninsula, due of the potential for landings there. The 303rd, 2213 men, 206th, 213 men, and 146th, 17459 men were the 3 divisions that were spread out along the southwest coast. In order to be prepared to march to support any of the 2 armies, a 4th division, the 77th, 15640 men, was kept in reserve further north. The 206th region included the beaches where the Marines would arrive. 5 divisions, 2 infantry brigades, and 2 tank brigades made up the 57th Army, which was stationed to protect the island's hinterland and east coast areas. Sumiyoshi, a village a few miles north of the actual landing beaches, was where the Japanese were anticipating the invasion. The 2 southernmost divisions were supposed to stay in place regardless of where the landings occurred, while the 212th, 21351 men, 154th, 17341 men, and 156th, 17429 men were positioned far north of the planned landings south of Miyazaki. In reality, parts of the 212th Division, which was supposed to advance to support other divisions, were located north of the Allied advance line. In order to protect the Kobayashi Plain from a paratroop attack, the 25th Division, 25804 men, was positioned farther interior. Its main purpose was to be kept in reserve until it became necessary to bolster the forces on the beaches. The Japanese retained a large portion of their tank power and several thousand troops inland to fight against airborne operations on the plains, not realizing that MacArthur was determined about not using paratroopers in the invasion despite the War Department's insistence on their employment. The 2 intended invasion beaches on the east side of the island were occupied by just the 86th Division, 2614 troops. It was situated behind the southernmost of the southeast landing beaches, Arikake Bay's head. Although coastal artillery had been set up around Ariake Bay, the majority of the Japanese positions at Miyazaki were located north of the landing beach. In reality, 1 brigade was stationed at the head of Kagoshima Bay, and the other was on an isolated island. Although they were unsure of the precise target, the Japanese expected simultaneous landings on at least 3 locations. Additionally, they had wildly misjudged the size of the American invasion force. On each beach, American forces would therefore have a numerical advantage. Japanese troop movements would have been difficult, if not impossible, given the railroads already rendered ineffective and the limited highways closely monitored by Allied planes. The Japanese forces were somewhat protected from air attacks as long as they were hidden, but if they were moving, it would be simple to identify them. The only relatively safe routes they could have taken would have been on pathways through the dark hills. Additional troops were supposed to be brought over from Honshu as part of the Ketsu-Go plan, but it was doubtful that many could have made it through because American ships and submarines were operating on the inland sea and American aircraft dominated the skies. The only way to get more troops would have been to traverse the narrow strait separating the two islands, but even if they made it safely to Kyushu, they would still be more than 150 miles away from the invaders and would have been constantly attacked by aircraft as they traveled south. A tunnel that would have connected the two islands had started construction in 1937, but had been put on hold when war broke out. MacArthur's team devised a plan to use remote-controlled air-sea rescue boats loaded with explosives to shut the tunnel, but the Allies were unaware that development had stopped. The Japanese officers fought to the death in the hopes of stopping the U.S. forces from establishing a beachhead, knowing that reinforcement was doubtful. The invasion strategy for Kyushu, Operation Olympic, called for 3 landings at 3 different places, with 3 divisions each, plus auxiliary forces. U.S. The men of the 6th Army would arrive around Koyama on Ariake Bay in the southeast and just south of Miyazaki on the east coast. They would then drive inland to seize the area surrounding Miyako-Nojo and head southwest toward Kagoshima Bay. In order to cut off all Japanese soldiers south of the invasion beaches, the 3 Marine divisions of the V's amphibious force would land on the southwest side near Kushikino and drive east to Kagoshima Bay. The airfields that would be built on the Miyazaki and Miyako-Nojo plains would be protected by a defense line drawn northeast-southwest to the north. Each landing force would include tanks, artillery, and more than 1,000 combat men. More than 4,000 men would make up the attack force, and another 17,000 would be added as follow-up, for a total of 6,000 troops. Only 3,000 were anticipated by the Japanese. When Olympic was drafted in May, the invading force was expected to have 700 troops, including Far East Air Force's soldiers, communications and support staff, and combat engineers, in addition to more than 4,000 vehicles that would accompany the air combat groups to Kyushu. The invading army would be armed with powerful air and artillery components, which are known as force multipliers in today's military terminology, essentially making it even larger. Interrogators from the 6th Army discovered that the Japanese actually lacked a coherent defense strategy. They had just instructed the commanders to fight to the end, and concentrated their forces in the general area of the anticipated landings. Nevertheless, the commanding general of the 40th Army had determined that his forces were insufficient to fight the invaders on the beaches without reinforcement, and he had planned to retire to positions that were ready in the hills above them. At command levels below that of the 16th Area Army Headquarters, which was situated on the north end of the island, over 150 miles distant, there appeared to be no communication between the Army and the air and naval forces. As the Japanese ground forces faced continuous air attacks, they could not expect any air help. Additionally, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers from the Pacific Fleet would be constantly bombarding them from just offshore, getting as near to the American troops as they could in the hopes that this would lessen the efficacy of air and naval fire support, was their only line of defense against air attack and naval bombardment. The strongest forces yet gathered in the Pacific War would back the invading troops. In order to make air superiority over the invasion region by land-based aircraft a need for the invasion to occur, General MacArthur's staff had observed the difficulties encountered by the Marines on Iwo Jima and the 10th Army on Okinawa, and contrasted them with their own experiences. Early in the war, MacArthur's chief airman, General George Kenney, had come to believe that carrier-based aircraft alone were insufficient to cover a beachhead, and his observations on Iwo Jima and Okinawa had confirmed his theory. In order to control the skies over southern Kyushu, disrupt enemy surface transportation, destroy ground defenses prior to the invasion, and then support ground forces, 40 Far East Air Force's combat groups, consisting of nearly 3,000 bombers and fighters, were assigned to airfields in the Ryukyus and Bonins as part of the initial planning for Olympic. By July, the plan had grown to include 10 more groups. Some fighter squadrons and light and medium bomber squadrons would head north to Kyushu as soon as airstrips could be made ready. The command organization for the B-29's 20th Air Force, which was not included in the invading force and was an independent entity directly under the command of General Henry Hap Arnold, the Chief of Army Air Forces in Washington, would supply additional land-based air power. More than 1,000 B-29s were already flying out of Marianas sites by the middle of 1945, and Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle's 8th Air Force was bringing more of them to Okinawa. The B-29s might be employed against Kyushu defenses if necessary, but their primary objective was to keep pressure on Japanese industry and other key targets. Given that the Far East Air Forces had multiple heavy bomber groups with B-24s on the Ryukyu and Bonin Islands, such a necessity would have been improbable. Due to the formation of 2 squadrons of consolidated B-32s in the Philippines, the Far East Air Forces also possessed their own heavy bombers. The air groups aboard the U.S. carriers would contribute additional air-striking force. By the time of the invasion, the Pacific Fleet is anticipated to have about 1,900 aircraft in Japanese seas, U.S. and Far East Air Forces. The B-29s were not included in the almost 5,000 combat aircraft that made up the Pacific Fleet's air power alone. Furthermore, 10 bomber squadrons from Britain's Royal Air Force had committed to supporting the invasion on Okinawa, and 10 more were being planned. Prior to the invasion, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff intended to use air power to dump more bombs on Japan than had been dropped on Germany throughout the war. As more squadrons arrived in the Ryukyus, the intensity of the strikes quickly escalated. In May, Far East Air Force's fighter bombers deployed onto airfields on Hiroshima and started operating over Kyushu. Almost anything that moved was shot up by the P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. B-25 and A-26 strafers joined them in their low-altitude strikes. At the conclusion of the war, A-20s from the Far East Air Forces were getting ready to move to Okinawa. B-25s focused on bridges, railroad trestles, and tunnels, while 4-engine B-24s hit port facilities, railroad marshalling yards, and other key targets on Kyushu. The 5th Air Force adopted the stance that there were no more civilians in Japan after Japan declared that all physically fit men and women were involved in the homeland defense. When 5th Air Force fighter pilots returned from a sweep over Kyushu on August 4th, 2 days before the mushroom cloud formed above Hiroshima, they reported that residents were waving white flags everywhere on the island. It was only the start. Attacks on Japanese defenses in southern Kyushu would increase in the final weeks before D-Day. The entire United States would likewise back the invaders, the Pacific Fleet. During the conflict, the U.S. The Navy supported amphibious operations with its older battleships, some of which had massive 16-inch guns capable of firing a 2,700-pound projectile across a 25-mile distance. The earliest ships were equipped with 14-inch guns that could fire projectiles weighing 1,400 pounds. With a single volley, any cannon could destroy an entire bunker complex. Smaller artillery was carried by cruisers and destroyers, but they could still launch massive firepower at ashore targets. The greatest naval force ever seen throughout the conflict would come together to back the landings. There is no question that the Japanese would have fought hard, and that there may have been a significant number of losses among the landing soldiers during the initial assault if the invasion had actually occurred. However, the 6th Army assessment shows that the Japanese fortifications were poorly planned and weaker than has been argued. Although there was no way to pinpoint the precise number, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff provided President Truman with a ballpark estimate of about 4,000 people killed in action on Kyushu. The Joint Chiefs and MacArthur's staff realized by the middle of July that an armed invasion was never going to happen and started preparing to implement the Operation Blacklist plan, which was created for a peaceful occupation of Japan. Early in August, plans were initiated for the Pacific Air Transport Command and the Far East Air Force's Troop Carrier Command to move the 11th Airborne and 27th Infantry Divisions to Japan in order to start the occupation. On August 15th, Japan accepted surrender terms that required a U.S. occupation of the country, but allowed Emperor Hirohito to retain his throne. 10 days later, two 5th Air Force P-38 pilots, Flight Officer Hall and Colonel Clay Tice, commander of the 49th Fighter Group, landed at Nidagahara Airfield on Kyushu, claiming they were running low on the fuel. A few minutes later, a B-17 with air-sea rescue equipment touched down. Japanese soldiers greeted the airmen warmly and gave them pipes and pumps to move fuel from the B-17 to the fighters. Author Sam McGowan lives in Missouri City, Texas, and is a professional pilot who frequently contributes to WW2's history.